Hi there, and welcome to Ready.Set.Midmarket, the premier podcast for mid-market IT executives. I'm Samara Lynn, senior editor of MES Computing. Now, I'm usually joined by my co-host, Adam Dennison. He is the vice president of midsize enterprise services at the Channel Company, MES Computing's parent company. Adam's traveling on business currently, and we look forward to seeing him on the next episode. But today, we are so excited to welcome Steve Leslie. He is the CEO of Quadbridge. Welcome, Steve.
Samara, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and thanks for having us.
Thank you. And now Quadbridge just released a research paper on the state of AI adoption in the mid-market. Steve, I figured we'd just jump right into it. First of all, just tell us a bit about Quadbridge for, some of the folks who may not know, and the reasons for developing this report.
Yeah, so Quadbridge is a US and Canadian solution provider with a focus on helping mid-market companies implement AI at scale. So connected to the report, we do a lot of research with our customer base in the mid-market space. And there's probably two touch points. We do a deep dive research, but then we produce this white paper as a result of some things we saw in our deep dive research. And we wanted to go a little further. So we ended up working with a group of two groups actually in two ideation sessions to create the white paper.
What do you think were some of like the three big findings from the data?
Yeah, it's really interesting because when we did our client research, this really elevated to the top at the end of 2025 compared to previous years. And I'm talking about modernization and AI adoption. So yeah, there's probably three things to your point. There's in adoption in mid-market, there's this natural grassroots employees want to adopt the tools, and that's very common in mid-market. Um, the second swim lane is, the head of IT wants to implement these tools and experiment with these tools. The third swim lane, which is a bit rare, and it only showed up in about 10% of our cases, is where it was driven from the top strategically. So we can talk about that as we get into the discussion today.
I think another concept that kind of struck me in the report was this idea that in the mid-market, AI adoption is active but informal.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think that's a great phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah, can
Yeah.
you
No,
expound on that?
it's very true. It's interesting. I know you do predominantly work in the mid-market space, and I'm sure you see this. If you look at a mid-market firm compared to an enterprise firm, the IT organization tends to be, it's relatively small. And mid-market's a big span of, 10 million in revenue up to a billion. So, these teams tend to be relatively small. So the informal comes from usually somebody on the team wants to start to experiment or an employee wants to use a tool, and that's how it gets introduced to IT. The other side of it is the board or the CEO says, hey, you got to start to experiment with these tools. We want to deploy AI. So that's where you get sort of that informal. Go to active because that's where we usually cross the bridge to the things stalling a little bit. Active deployment usually is okay. They've seen some promise in some of the experimentation with the generative tools. Maybe they've deployed an agent or two, and all of a sudden they cross, I'll call it the chasm to, okay, we want to scale agents now. And that's where I would say we get into an interesting dynamic in mid-market where they have
Mhm.
to cross the bridge to, okay, what's our strategy for automation in the company? We
Gotcha. So what you're seeing in the report, that's coming from from surveying your own customer base, which I'm largely guessing are mid-size organizations. Is that
Yeah.
okay? So this all reflects what you're seeing out there as you're servicing these companies and these organizations. Gotcha.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things I will mention, Samara, is we just came off of our Cupid's event last week where we host about 150 mid-market customers, and we do this annually. And in that, and this is an interesting dynamic relative to our conversation today around AI adoption in mid-market. The big priority for mid-market leaders in IT in terms of wanting to come to an event like this is not the technology. It's the leadership and the strategy skills. So it's fascinating at this event, and we saw this emerge about 3 years ago. And I think it's related to the dynamic with mid-market leadership teams in IT specifically. They're leaned on quite heavily to drive the strategy in the areas of AI adoption. And they're sitting at the table. And the expectation of IT leaders in mid-market more and more, especially as it pertains to something as powerful as automation technologies and AI, is okay, you need to build a strategy company-wide to execute this. So one of the things that's fascinating about this is that it's really viewed differently than a technology strategy. It's okay, how can you help us develop the organizational strategy to drive the adoption so we can drive automation across the company?
And do you find also with your customers, dealing with IT senior leaders, is there some difficulty pivoting from thinking like, a technical person and as opposed to a business person?
That is the number one thing they tell us prior to the event. We develop the agenda of the event based on their feedback. So we
Right.
ask them, what do you want to focus on? And leadership and strategy for the last 3 years have been one and two. So they want to learn how to sell their ideas, how to you know, uh, gain agreement. They want to learn how to map the IT strategy to the organizational strategy. And when they're getting into conversations about AI adoption, because it is so impactful organization wide, that they need to develop those skills. And if I sort of go in just real quick, like the skills they need to develop specifically, they want to develop is okay. How do I develop a strategy that I can go in front of into the boardroom and
Right.
talk about? The second thing is how do I gain agreement on the priorities of phasing in AI at scale and driving automation in the organization? And the third, I would put it in the category as of just pure leadership skills, soft skills. How do I lead my team through change in a world where we're moving very fast and we're adopting a very exciting set of tools and technologies?
And I think that's what's so interesting to me about the Quadbridge research was and I want to go back to the four pillars and you touched on them: the intent, data foundation, guardrails, and leadership and culture. With that said, mid market teams, they have limited staff, limited resources. If they want to nail one of those pillars first, which one should they prioritize before launching a AI project?
Data governance and security.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the number one thing, and your point on limited budgets is very, very true. We do a lot of work on that
Right.
about, what's the capital requirements for these types of projects, and as you know, they can range, like, these can be investments of a $500,000 to $3 million, depending upon the size and depending upon, the phases of the project and how far you wanna go.
Right.
But it's a big investment, but the data governance and data security, number one. The other elements are very important though that we spoke about.
What's one action a CIO can take today, tomorrow, next week to avoid that
Yeah.
hole?
So I would say when they've done their experimentation, they've done their pilots, they see a couple of wins. The costly mistake is before they go to scale, they don't engage organizational leadership on what the overall strategy is. And the big thing that we're seeing is if you don't have that in place, if you're not communicating these changes to all employees in the right way and driving the engagement and driving the adoption, there is cultural pushback you're going to receive. And I know that your team is aware of the pushback. There's a lot of fear around some of these tools, and it has to be positioned appropriately that this is about making everybody's role easier, adopting these tools to make them more productive, able to serve their internal clients and external clients a lot better. But that's probably the big thing is before you move to scale, make sure you engage at the strategy layer and make sure the cultural element is managed very, very well so that you can drive the change in the organization to adoption.
Yeah. Well, see, this is a great conversation. And I think I got a copy of that report. I guess we could share the link if folks want to take a look at it.
Percent. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And we'll also
You
have
can
the
send.
great, wonderful. It's got some really great information for mid-market senior IT leadership. So, I suggest taking a look at it. And we'll also have it on our MES computing site. Steve, this was a great conversation and so timely and so relevant. And I want to thank you so much for your time. So, I mean, just really great information. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your time as well, and thank you for all the work you do. You're doing all the great work in our space, and we love it. We love your support. Obviously, the pieces that you're writing and this podcast in particular is a great resource for all of our customers.
Thanks, Steve. I'll share that with the team. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.